The dust settled over the broken windmill as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the parched Texas plains. Tabitha Porter wiped the sweat from her brow with a handkerchief that had once been white but now carried the amber stains of hard work and harder living. She'd ridden 15 miles from her father's struggling ranch to find the one man folks said could fix anything, only to discover him in a state she never expected. It was 1885, and the drought had been merciless. 2 years of barely enough rain to dampen the soil had turned the once prosperous cattle country into a desperate land of empty water troughs and dying dreams. Tabitha's family ranch was hanging by a thread. Their windmill, the lifeblood of their cattle operation, had finally given up the ghost 3 days ago. "Mr. Guthrie," she called, approaching the small cabin beside the broken windmill. When no answer came, she moved around to the back where she found him. Ross Guthrie sat on an upturned crate, his head buried in his calloused hands, shoulders slumped in defeat. His tools lay scattered around him like fallen soldiers after a battle. She had heard stories of his skill, how ranchers from 3 counties sought him out when machinery failed, how his hands could coax life back into the most stubborn of contraptions. But the man before her looked beaten, his once proud shoulders hunched under the weight of something she couldn't yet understand. "Mr. Guthrie," she said again, softer this time. He looked up, his face weathered from years under the relentless sun, eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Recognition flickered in them, not of her personally, but of what she represented. Another desperate rancher seeking salvation he couldn't provide. "I can't fix it," he said, voice as dry as the land around them. "I can't fix any of it anymore." Tabitha stepped closer, her gaze shifting from the broken man to the disassembled windmill parts spread across the hard ground. "Then don't," she said simply. "Just heal." His eyebrows furrowed, confusion momentarily replacing his despair. "What?" "Some things don't need fixing," she continued, surprising herself with her own words. "They need healing. And sometimes, so do the people trying to fix them." The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant cry of a hawk riding thermals above the plains. Tabitha hadn't come for philosophy. She'd come because her family needed water, and without a working windmill, their cattle would die, and with them, everything her father had built. But something in the defeated slump of Ross Guthrie's shoulders told her that demanding his help would get her nowhere. "My name's Tabitha Porter," she said, extending her hand. "My pa's windmill broke 3 days ago. We've been hauling water from the creek, but it's nearly dry itself. They said you were the man who could help." Ross Guthrie stared at her outstretched hand for a long moment before taking it. His grip was firm despite his dejected posture. "Ross," he replied, releasing her hand, "and they were wrong. I can't help anyone anymore." Tabitha glanced at the tools scattered around him. "Did something happen to your hands?" "My hands work fine," he said, flexing his fingers. "It's everything else that's broken." She tilted her head, studying him. At perhaps 30 years old, he wasn't much older than her 22 years, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had lived several lifetimes. "Would you tell me about it over some coffee?" she asked, gesturing to his cabin. "I've ridden a long way, and I'm parched." For a moment she thought he might refuse, but then he nodded, rising from the crate with a weariness that seemed bone deep. The cabin was spare, but neat, with a single room serving as both living quarters and workshop. Tools hung on the walls in careful arrangements, each with its place. A narrow cot occupied one corner, a small pot-bellied stove another. A table with 2 mismatched chairs stood in the center. Ross moved to the stove, his actions mechanical as he stoked the fire and set a pot of coffee to boil. Tabitha sat at the table, removing her hat and placing it beside her. "Never seen a woman ride out alone to find a windmill repairman," Ross said, his back to her as he worked. "Never seen a repairman give up on a windmill before even looking at it," she countered. The ghost of a smile touched his lips as he turned, placing 2 tin cups on the table. "Fair enough." When the coffee was ready, he filled both cups and sat across from her. The bitter aroma filled the small space, momentarily masking the scent of oil and metal that seemed embedded in the very walls. "So," she began, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "What happened?" Ross took a slow sip before answering. "Westbrook Ranch. Big spread about 20 miles west of here. Their main pump system failed last week. I couldn't fix it. Tried for 3 days straight, barely slept. But whatever I did, It kept breaking down again. One failure doesn't make you— It wasn't just one, he interrupted. Before that, it was the Thompson's irrigation system, and before that, the mill at Coopersville. I used to be able to hear what was wrong with the machine, feel it in my bones. Now, he shook his head, now all I hear is grinding metal, and all I feel is failure. Tabitha considered this. My grandmother used to say that when you lose one sense, the others sharpen. What sense have I lost? I don't know yet, she replied honestly. But I aim to find out, because my family needs that windmill working, Mr. Guthrie, and I'm not leaving without your help. Ross looked up sharply. I told you, you can't fix it, I heard you, but maybe you can teach me how. He stared at her as if she'd suggested they fly to the moon. You want to learn to repair windmills? I want to save my family's ranch, she corrected, and if that means learning to repair a windmill, then that's what I'll do. Ross shook his head, but Tabitha saw something new in his eyes, a flicker of interest breaking through the despair. It's not women's work, he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Tabitha laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise them both. Mr. Guthrie, I've been breaking horses, mending fences, and helping with calving since I was 12 years old. I think I can handle a windmill. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but expectant, like the pause before a thunderclap. Finally, Ross sighed. We'd need to see your windmill first, understand what's wrong with it. Tabitha felt hope surge through her. Does that mean you'll help? It means I'll look, he clarified. No promises beyond that. It was enough. For now, it was enough. We can leave at first light, she said, finishing her coffee. I'll need to stay the night if that's acceptable. It's too far to ride back before dark. Ross nodded, suddenly awkward as he glanced around his bachelor quarters. You can have the bed. I'll sleep outside. Nonsense, Tabitha said firmly. I've got my bedroll. The floor by the stove will be fine. She could tell he wanted to argue but decided against it. Instead, he rose and began clearing away the coffee cups. I should check on my horse, she said, standing, and then perhaps you could show me what you were working on when I arrived. The windmill? He asked, gesturing toward the back of the cabin. No, she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Whatever it was that had your head in your hands. Ross hesitated, then nodded. After you see to your horse. Outside, as Tabitha unsaddled her mare and rubbed her down, she wondered what exactly she had gotten herself into. She'd come for a repairman and instead found a broken man who needed as much fixing as her family's windmill. Yet, something about Ross Guthrie's defeated posture had stirred something in her, a determination not just to save her family's ranch, but somehow to help him find his way back to himself. It was foolish, perhaps, to take on both challenges, but Tabitha Porter had never been one to walk away from someone in need. As the sun disappeared behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the parched earth, Tabitha led her horse to a small corral adjacent to Ross's cabin. Inside, a single chestnut gelding raised its head in mild interest before returning to the meager hay scattered on the ground. That's Copper, Ross said, appearing at her side with such quiet steps that Tabitha startled slightly. Sorry, he added, noticing her reaction. It's all right, she replied, securing the gate after her mare. You move quietly for a man your size. It was true standing beside her now. Ross Guthrie was a solid presence, tall and broad-shouldered, though leaner than he should be, as if recent months had worn away at him like water over stone. Years of listening to machinery, he explained with a half-shrug. You learn to move quiet, to hear the problems. And now? She asked, unable to keep herself from probing the wound he'd revealed earlier. His jaw tightened. Now I hear nothing but my own failures. Before she could respond, he turned away. Come on. I'll show you what I was working on. He led her to a small clearing behind the cabin where various windmill parts lay in what appeared to be organized chaos. At the center stood a partially assembled mechanism that Tabitha couldn't immediately identify. It's a new kind of water pump, Ross explained, kneeling beside it. My own design. Something that could draw water from deeper than the standard pumps work with less wind. Tabitha moved closer, genuinely intrigued. For the drought? He nodded. Started designing it last year when the rains first failed. Thought maybe He trailed off, his hand hovering over the intricate gears before dropping back to his side. Doesn't matter now. It doesn't work. What's wrong with it? She asked, crouching beside him to examine the contraption. Everything. Nothing. His frustration was palpable. The theory is sound. I've checked the calculations 100 times, but when I put it together, it seizes up after a few rotations. Tabitha studied the mechanism, noting the care evident in each precisely cut piece. This wasn't just a practical invention, it was a labor of love. "May I?" she asked, reaching toward it. Ross hesitated, then nodded. Carefully, she turned the main gear, watching as the connected parts moved in sequence. The motion was smooth initially, but after 3 full rotations, a high-pitched whine emerged, and the gears ground to a halt. "See?" Ross said, his voice heavy with defeat. "Always stops there. I've replaced every piece, recalibrated every measurement, nothing helps." Tabitha sat back on her heels, thoughtful. "My brother Thomas had a music box that did something similar, worked perfect for a while, then stopped at the same spot every time." Ross looked at her, a flicker of curiosity breaking through his dejection. What was wrong with it? A piece of my mother's hair had gotten wound up in the mechanism, something so small we almost couldn't see it, but it was enough to stop everything. Ross turned back to the pump, his brow furrowed. "I've taken it apart piece by piece. There's nothing caught in it." "Sometimes," Tabitha said softly, "the thing stopping us isn't in the machinery at all." His head snapped up, eyes meeting hers with sudden intensity. "What do you mean?" "I'm not sure yet," she admitted. "Just a feeling." The sun had set completely now, leaving them in the growing darkness, the pump between them like a shared secret. "We should get inside," Ross finally said, rising to his feet and offering her his hand. "Early start tomorrow." Tabitha took his hand, noticing the strength in it despite the gentleness of his grip. His palm was calloused, marked with small scars, the biography of a man who worked with his hands, written in flesh. "Thank you," she said, not releasing his hand immediately, "for agreeing to look at our windmill." "Don't thank me yet," he replied, though some of the harshness had left his voice. "I haven't fixed anything in weeks." "Maybe you don't need to fix it," she repeated her earlier words. "Maybe you just need to heal it, and yourself." He withdrew his hand then, uncomfortable with her insight. "Machines don't heal, Miss Porter. They're fixed or they're broken. There's no in-between." "And people," she challenged. Ross didn't answer, turning instead toward the cabin, his shoulders once again bearing the invisible weight she'd first noticed. Inside, Ross busied himself preparing a simple supper of beans, bacon, and cornbread that he pulled from a small Dutch oven. The food was surprisingly good, the cornbread especially moist and flavorful. "This is delicious," Tabitha commented after her first bite. "Did your mother teach you to cook?" A shadow passed over his face. "No. Learned out of necessity." She sensed the closed door in his response and didn't push. Instead, she told him about her family's ranch, how her father had built it from nothing after the war, how her mother had died of influenza 5 years ago, leaving Tabitha to care for her father and younger brother. "Thomas is 17 now," she explained. "Smart as a whip but restless, talks about going east to school, though Pa needs him on the ranch." "And you?" Ross asked, surprising her with his interest. "What do you want?" Tabitha considered the question, realizing it had been a long time since anyone had asked her that. "I want the ranch to succeed," she said finally. "I want my family to be secure." "That's what you want for others," Ross observed. "What do you want for yourself?" The question caught her off guard, and she found herself answering more honestly than she'd intended. "I want to matter, to build something lasting, not just be someone's wife or daughter or sister, but to create something of my own." Ross nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's why you want to learn about the windmill. Not just to save your family's ranch, but to know how it works, to master it." "Yes," she admitted, relieved that he understood. "Is that foolish?" "No," he said simply. "It's brave." After supper, Ross insisted Tabitha take the bed despite her protests. He set up his bedroll near the stove, turning his back politely as she prepared for sleep, removing only her boots and outer shirt, lying down in her camisole and trousers. The bed smelled of him a clean, masculine scent of soap and leather, and something uniquely his own. Tabitha found it oddly comforting as exhaustion from the long ride and emotional day pulled her toward sleep. Mr. Guthrie, she murmured, already half dreaming. Ross, he corrected quietly from his place by the stove. Just Ross. Ross, she repeated, the name feeling right on her lips. Thank you. I haven't done anything yet, he reminded her. You've given me hope, she said, her words slurring with approaching sleep. Sometimes that's enough to start with. In the dim light cast by the banked fire, she thought she saw him smile a genuine expression that transformed his face, hinting at the man he might have been before, whatever had broken his spirit. Good night, Tabitha, he said softly. Good night, Ross, she replied, allowing sleep to claim her at last. Morning came with the first tentative rays of sun filtering through the cabin's single window. Tabitha woke to find Ross already up, his bedroll neatly stowed, coffee brewing on the stove. He stood at the small table, packing supplies into saddlebags. Good morning, she said, sitting up and quickly smoothing her hair. He glanced over, nodding in acknowledgement. There's coffee and some biscuits left from yesterday. We should leave within the hour if we want to reach your ranch by midday. Tabitha appreciated his businesslike manner, which allowed her to wash up and prepare for the day without awkwardness. By the time she'd splashed water on her face and pinned up her hair, Ross had saddled both horses and secured his tools to Copper's saddle. The ride to the Porter Ranch took most of the morning. They traveled side by side when the trail allowed, Ross mostly silent but occasionally pointing out landmarks or asking practical questions about the windmill, how old it was, when the problems started, what maintenance had been done. Pa bought it second-hand from the McDermott place when they went bust in '79, Tabitha explained. It worked fine until 3 days ago. Just stopped turning, though there was plenty of wind. Could be the main shaft bearing, Ross mused, or the tail assembly might have come loose. Tabitha listened carefully, storing away the terminology for future reference. Could I learn to maintain it myself, after you show me what's wrong? Ross glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Basic maintenance, sure. Some repairs, too, if you're handy with tools. But some problems require specialized equipment. Like what you carry, she asked, nodding toward his saddlebags. Some of it. Other things I make as needed. You're an inventor as well as a repairman. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the designation. I solve problems. Or I used to. You will again, she said with quiet confidence. He didn't argue, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. They crested a small rise, and the Porter Ranch came into view below them, a modest house, barn, and several outbuildings surrounded by fenced pastures. In the distance, cattle clustered near a dried creek bed, seeking non-existent water. That's them, Tabitha said, pointing to 2 figures near the windmill tower, my father and brother. As they approached, Thomas Porter spotted them first, waving enthusiastically. At 17, he was all gangly limbs and boundless energy, his face alight with hope at the sight of Ross. Her father, James Porter, stood straighter, his weather-beaten face guarded but relieved. He was a proud man who had built his ranch through sheer determination, and asking for help didn't come easily to him. Tabitha, he called as they dismounted. We were getting worried. I found Mr. Guthrie, she replied, gesturing to Ross. He's agreed to look at the windmill. Grateful to you, sir, James said, extending his hand. James Porter. Ross shook it firmly. Ross Guthrie. I'll do what I can, but I can't promise anything. James nodded, understanding the cautious commitment. All we ask is that you try. Without water. He didn't need to finish the thought. They all knew what was at stake. Thomas approached, practically vibrating with curiosity. Are those specialized tools? I've never seen anything like them. Did you make them yourself? How does the windmill mechanism actually work? Is it true you once fixed a steam engine blindfolded? Thomas, Tabitha admonished, let Mr. Guthrie breathe. Ross surprised her with a small chuckle. It's all right, and no, I never fixed anything blindfolded. Though I did once repair a pump system during a midnight thunderstorm. Thomas's eyes widened with admiration. That must have been something to see. Something to feel, more like, Ross corrected, moving toward the windmill. Couldn't see a damn excuse me a thing. Had to go by touch and sound. Tabitha followed as Ross circled the windmill, studying it from every angle before approaching the tower. The structure stood about 40 feet tall, its fan motionless despite the steady breeze. I'll need to climb up, Ross said, removing his jacket and rolling up his sleeves. "Check the head assembly first." "I'll come with you," Tabitha offered immediately. Ross turned to her, surprise evident on his face. "It's not safe." "Neither's watching our cattle die of thirst," she countered. "If I'm going to learn, I need to see everything." James stepped forward. "Tabitha, perhaps you should let Mr. Guthrie—" "It's all right, Mr. Porter," Ross interrupted, his eyes still on Tabitha. "If she wants to learn, she should see it all. But you follow my instructions exactly, understand?" Tabitha nodded, removing her own jacket and securing her hair more tightly under her hat. The climb was daunting but manageable, the tower's ladder sturdy despite its age. Ross went first, moving with the ease of long practice, occasionally pointing out handholds or cautioning Tabitha about loose rungs. When they reached the platform just below the fan, he helped her onto it, his hand steadying her elbow. "Watch your head," he warned as they ducked beneath the motionless blades, "and don't touch anything until I tell you." For the next hour, Ross methodically examined every part of the windmill's head, explaining each component as he worked. Tabitha proved an apt pupil, asking insightful questions and quickly grasping the mechanical principles involved. "There," Ross said finally, pointing to a section where the main shaft connected to the gears. "See that?" Tabitha leaned closer, her shoulder brushing against his as she peered at the spot he indicated. "It looks worn." "Exactly. The bearing's shot. It's creating too much friction, preventing the wheel from turning freely." He sat back, wiping sweat from his brow. "I can fix it, but I'll need to fabricate a new bearing. The one you have is an odd size." Hope surged through Tabitha. "You can fix it?" Ross nodded slowly. "This one, yes, it's a straightforward problem." He glanced at her. Something like embarrassment crossing his features. "Not like the others I've failed on recently." "You haven't failed yet," she reminded him gently. "And this is a start, isn't it?" He held her gaze for a moment, something shifting in his expression. "Yes," he said finally. "I suppose it is." Back on the ground, Ross explained the situation to James, who listened with evident relief. "How long will it take to make this bearing?" he asked. "A day, maybe 2, Ross replied. "I'll need to return to my workshop to fabricate it." "You're welcome to stay here while you work," James offered. "Save you the trip back and forth." Ross hesitated, glancing at Tabitha before answering. "Thank you, but I need my forge and tools. I'll ride back today, start work immediately, and return as soon as it's ready." Tabitha felt a pang of disappointment. She understood the practicality of his decision. "I could ride back with you," she suggested. "Learn how you make the parts." "Tabitha," her father began, his tone cautionary. "Actually," Ross cut in, "an extra pair of hands would be helpful, if Mr. Porter can spare you." James looked between them, something knowing in his gaze that made Tabitha flush slightly. "We can manage for a day or 2, he said finally. "Thomas and I will continue hauling water from the Murphy's place." "I'll pack some supplies," Tabitha said, hurrying toward the house before anyone could change their minds. Inside, she quickly gathered what she needed, including a change of clothes and her mother's old journal, where she'd begun recording her observations about the ranch's operations. As she worked, her mind raced with thoughts of spending more time with Ross, learning his craft, perhaps even helping him past whatever had broken his confidence. It was foolish, she knew, to feel such a connection to a man she'd just met. Yet something about Ross Guthrie called to her, his quiet competence, the gentleness beneath his gruff exterior, the pain he carried that matched her own in ways she couldn't yet articulate. When she returned outside, Ross was deep in conversation with Thomas, sketching something in the dirt with a stick while her brother watched, rapt. The sight warmed her heart, reminding her of how their father used to teach them about ranching before grief had made him more distant. "Ready?" Ross asked as she approached, rising from his crouched position. "Yes," she replied, securing her bag to her saddle. "What were you showing Thomas?" "How to check the pump at the base of the windmill," he explained. "It's in good condition, but needs regular maintenance. I showed him what to look for." Thomas beamed with pride at being entrusted with such responsibility. "I'll check it daily, just like you said." James approached, extending his hand to Ross once more. "We appreciate your help, Mr. Guthrie, and taking Tabitha under your wing." "She's a quick study," Ross replied, and Tabitha felt a surge of pleasure at the genuine admiration in his voice. "Might put me out of business if I teach her too much." The joke, The first she'd heard from him lightened the mood as they mounted up to leave. With promises to return as soon as possible, they set off, riding side by side as the Porter ranch receded behind them. "Thank you," Tabitha said once they were alone on the trail, "for letting me come along and for helping us." Ross kept his eyes on the horizon. "Don't thank me until the windmill's working again." "I'm not just thanking you for the windmill," she clarified, "but for teaching, for treating me like I'm capable of understanding." He glanced at her then, his expression softening. "You are capable. More than most men I've tried to explain mechanics to." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic clop of hooves against hard-packed earth the only sound. The sun climbed higher, its heat intensifying, but Tabitha barely noticed, her mind too occupied with questions about the man beside her. "May I ask you something personal?" she ventured finally. Ross tensed slightly but nodded. "You can ask. Can't promise I'll answer." "What happened to make you lose faith in your abilities? The real reason, not just the recent failures you mentioned." For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without looking at her, he began to speak, his voice low and measured. 8 months ago, there was a mining accident in Coopersville. Shaft collapsed, trapping 12 men. They called me in because the pumps had failed, and water was rising in the shaft. Tabitha's breath caught. She remembered hearing about the disaster, how it had shaken the entire county. "I worked for 36 hours straight," Ross continued. "Got the pumps working again, helped clear enough debris to create an airway. Everyone thought we'd get them out alive." He fell silent. And Tabitha didn't need to ask what happened next. The whole region knew that despite heroic rescue efforts, all 12 miners had perished. "It wasn't your fault," she said softly. "You did everything possible." "Did I?" His voice was raw with doubt. "If I'd been faster, figured out a better solution, maybe some of them would have survived. Or maybe none of them would have had a chance at all without your help," she countered. "You gave them hope, time for their families to say goodbye." Ross shook his head, unconvinced. "After that, it seemed like everything I touched fell apart. The irrigation system at the Thompsons, the mill at Coopersville, Westbrook's pump. It's like I lost whatever gift I had." "Or maybe you lost something else," Tabitha suggested gently. "Your belief in yourself. Your healing hand." He looked at her then, really looked at her, his eyes searching hers for something mockery, perhaps, or empty platitudes. Finding neither, his expression shifted subtly. "My father used to say that tools have souls," he said after a moment, "that they respond to the hands that hold them, the intentions behind them. I always thought it was nonsense. And now I wonder if he was right, if machines can sense doubt the way horses can smell fear." Tabitha considered this. "When my mother died, I couldn't cook for months. Everything I tried burned or tasted wrong, even recipes I'd made 100 times before." "What changed?" Ross asked. "Time," she said simply. "And accepting that I wasn't just cooking, I was grieving. Once I acknowledged that, things slowly improved." They crested a hill, and Ross's cabin came into view in the distance. The sight of it, small and solitary against the vast landscape, suddenly struck Tabitha as terribly lonely. "How long have you lived alone?" she asked. 5 years, he replied, "since my father died. He built that cabin, taught me everything I know about machinery." "You must miss him." Ross nodded, a muscle working in his jaw. "Every day. He would have known how to fix that pump design I showed you. Wouldn't have given up on it." "You haven't given up," Tabitha said firmly. "You're just paused." The unexpected phrase drew a surprised laugh from Ross, a genuine sound that transformed his face. "Paused," he repeated. "I like that better than broken." They reached the cabin by mid-afternoon, the sun still high and merciless. After seeing to the horses, Ross led Tabitha to his workshop, a separate building behind the cabin that she hadn't noticed during her previous visit. Inside, the space was a marvel of organization and invention. Tools lined the walls in careful arrangements, workbenches occupied 3 sides of the room, and a small forge dominated the 4th. Shelves held jars of screws, nails, and other fasteners, each meticulously labeled. In one corner stood a large drafting table covered with detailed drawings. "This is incredible," Tabitha breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. You built all this yourself? Most of it, Ross confirmed, moving to one of the workbenches. My father started it. I expanded it over the years. He began gathering materials for the windmill bearing, explaining each step as he worked. Tabitha watched, fascinated as he measured, marked, and prepared the metal. The trick with bearings, he explained, is getting the tolerance exactly right. Too tight and it creates friction. Too loose and it wobbles, causing other problems. Tabitha moved closer, peering at the measurements he'd made. How do you know what's right? Experience, mostly. And this. He tapped his ear. You listen to the machine, it tells you what it needs. Like when you said you used to hear what was wrong with machines? He nodded, focusing on his work. Every machine has its own voice, its own rhythm. When something's wrong, the sound changes. If you know how to listen, you can diagnose most problems just by the sound. And you can't hear them anymore? Tabitha asked gently. Ross's hand stilled briefly. It's more that I don't trust what I'm hearing. I second-guess everything now. Because of the mine accident? Yes, he admitted, and everything that came after, every failure compounding the one before it. Tabitha laid her hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. Maybe you need to listen differently, not just to the machines, but to yourself. His eyes met hers, something vulnerable and searching in their depths. For a moment, Tabitha thought he might say more, might open up further about the wounds he carried. Instead, he turned back to his work, though he didn't move away from her touch. Let me show you how to use the calipers, he said, his voice gruff with suppressed emotion. It's essential for precise measurements. For the next several hours, they worked side by side, Ross teaching and Tabitha learning with an eagerness that seemed to energize him. As the day waned, he lit lamps around the workshop, the warm glow creating an intimate atmosphere that wrapped around them like a cocoon. You're a natural, Ross commented as Tabitha successfully measured a component on her third try. Most people take days to get the hang of calipers. I have a good teacher, she replied, smiling up at him. Their eyes held for a beat longer than necessary, something new and tentative growing in the space between them. Ross cleared his throat, breaking the moment. We should stop for dinner, he said, setting down his tools. It's getting late. In the cabin, he proved once again to be a competent cook, preparing a simple but satisfying meal of venison stew and more of his excellent cornbread. They ate at the small table, their knees occasionally brushing underneath, sending unexpected sparks through Tabitha each time. Tell me about your invention, she said as they finished eating. The water pump you were working on when I arrived yesterday. Ross hesitated, pushing the remaining stew around his bowl. It's nothing special. It didn't look like nothing, she countered. It looked important. He sighed, relenting. The drought's getting worse. Everyone knows it, but no one wants to talk about it. Standard windmills can only pump water from so deep. I've been trying to design something that could reach the lower water table, something that requires less wind to operate. That could save a lot of ranches, Tabitha said, understanding dawning. Including ours. Ross nodded. That was the idea. But like I said, it doesn't work. Keeps seizing up in the same spot every time. Could I see it again? With the lamps, we might spot something we missed in daylight. He looked reluctant, but agreed. After cleaning up from dinner, they returned outside, Ross carrying a lantern to illuminate the area where his invention lay. Tabitha crouched beside the mechanism, studying it more carefully than before. Show me exactly where it seizes, she requested. Ross knelt beside her, their shoulders touching as he reached for the main gear. Slowly, he turned it, and just as before, after 3 rotations, the mechanism whined and stopped. There, he said, frustration evident in his voice. Always the same spot. Tabitha leaned closer, squinting in the lamplight. Can you turn it back slightly, then forward again, right at the point where it sticks? Ross did as she asked, moving the gear back and forth in tiny increments. Tabitha watched intently, then suddenly reached out to stop his hand. Wait, she said. Hold the lantern closer. He raised the light, and Tabitha carefully reached into the mechanism, her fingers probing a tiny space between 2 gears. There's something, she murmured, her brow furrowed in concentration. With delicate precision, she extracted a small object and held it up to the light. It was a tiny shard of metal, no bigger than a fingernail clipping, wedged into a groove in one of the gears. "Like the hair in my brother's music box," she said softly, looking up at Ross. "Something so small, but in exactly the wrong place." Ross stared at the metal fragment in disbelief. "I checked every piece a dozen times." "How did I miss that?" "Sometimes we're too close to see clearly," Tabitha replied, "too focused on looking for big problems to notice the small ones." She placed the metal shard in his palm, her fingers lingering against his skin. "Try it now." With his free hand, Ross turned the gear again. This time, it moved smoothly through 4, 5, 6 rotations, the entire mechanism functioning perfectly. "It works," he breathed, wonder replacing the disbelief in his voice. "It actually works." "Of course it works," Tabitha said, smiling at the astonishment on his face. "You built it. You just needed another pair of eyes to see what you couldn't." Ross looked up from the mechanism to Tabitha, the lamplight casting golden highlights in her hair and illuminating the warmth in her eyes. Something shifted in his expression, a realization, perhaps, or a decision. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not just for finding the problem, but for helping you heal," she suggested when he trailed off. "Yes," he acknowledged, "for that." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Ross set the lantern down carefully, then reached out to brush a strand of hair from Tabitha's face, his touch feather light. "Tabitha," he began, hesitation and hope mingling in his voice. She leaned forward slightly, encouragement in every line of her body. "Yes?" The distance between them disappeared as Ross closed the gap, his lips finding hers in a kiss so gentle it was barely there, a question, not a demand. Tabitha answered by pressing closer, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they parted, Ross rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face. "I've known you for all of 2 days," he whispered. "How is it possible to feel this way so quickly?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I feel it too." He pulled back slightly, searching her eyes. "Your father might not approve. I'm just a repairman with a cabin in the middle of nowhere." "A repairman who's inventing a pump that could save ranches across 3 counties, she corrected. "And my father respects skill and honesty above all else. He'll approve once he knows you." Ross smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face, erasing the shadows that had lingered there since she'd first found him. "We should get some rest," he said, though he made no move to release her. "Tomorrow. We'll finish the bearing for your windmill and then test this pump properly." "Our windmill," Tabitha said, emphasizing the word, "and our pump." His smile widened at the correction. "Ours," he agreed, sealing the word with another kiss. The following morning dawned clear and bright, with a sense of promise that had been missing the day before. Tabitha woke to the sound of hammering from the workshop, evidence that Ross had risen early and returned to his craft with renewed vigor. She dressed quickly and made coffee in the cabin before bringing a cup out to him. She found him bent over the forge, the muscles in his arms flexing as he shaped the metal for the windmill bearing. "Good morning," she called, announcing her presence. He looked up, his face breaking into a smile that sent warmth coursing through her. "Morning. Sleep well?" "Better than I have in months," she admitted, handing him the coffee. "You're making good progress." Almost done," he confirmed, taking a grateful sip. "Should be ready to leave for your ranch by noon." Tabitha moved to the workbench where his water pump sat, now fully assembled and apparently functioning smoothly. "Have you tested it?" "Not yet," Ross replied, setting down his coffee and returning to the forge. "Wanted to finish the bearing first, but we'll test it before we leave." They worked together throughout the morning, Tabitha assisting where she could and learning at every step. Ross was a patient teacher, explaining the purpose of each tool, the properties of different metals, the mathematics behind his designs. By midday, the bearing was complete, a precisely crafted piece of metal that would allow the Porter windmill to turn freely once again. "It's beautiful," Tabitha said as Ross wrapped it carefully in oiled cloth for transport. "It's functional," he corrected, though pleasure at her praise colored his voice. "Things can be both," she insisted. "Like your water pump. Shall we test it now?" Ross nodded, his expression a mixture of excitement and lingering apprehension. Together, they carried the pump outside to a small well behind the workshop. "This is a test well I dug last year," Ross explained as he positioned the pump. "It's deeper than most, designed to mimic the conditions we're facing with the drought." He attached the pump to a specially built frame, then connected it to a small windmill vane that would capture even the gentlest breeze. With careful hands, he lowered the pump's intake pipe into the well. "Now we wait for wind," he said, stepping back to stand beside Tabitha. They didn't have to wait long. A breeze stirred the prairie grass, setting the vane in motion. The gears engaged, turning smoothly, and after a moment, water began to flow from the outlet pipe, a clear, steady stream that sparkled in the sunlight. "It works," Tabitha breathed, squeezing Ross's arm in excitement. "Ross, it actually works!" His face was a study in emotion disbelief giving way to joy, then to a fierce pride that straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin. "It works," he repeated, as if saying it aloud might make it more real. "It really works." Impulsively, Tabitha threw her arms around him, and he caught her, lifting her off her feet in an exuberant embrace. When he set her down, they were both laughing, the sound carrying across the open prairie. "Do you know what this means?" she asked, her hands still resting on his shoulders. "For ranchers, for farmers, for everyone affected by the drought?" Ross nodded, his eyes bright with possibility. "It means hope. A fighting chance, at least. And for you?" Tabitha pressed gently. His expression softened as he looked at her. "It means I found my way back. Thanks to you." "No," she shook her head. "You found your way back to yourself. I just happened to be there when you did." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch lingering. "You were more than just there, Tabitha Porter. You saw something in me I couldn't see myself. You reminded me how to heal instead of just fixing." The words echoed between them, carrying the weight of that first moment when she'd found him with his head in his hands. It seemed a lifetime ago now, though only days had passed. "We should get this bearing to your ranch," Ross said after a moment, though he made no move to step away from her. "Your father and brother are waiting." "They are," she agreed, smiling up at him, "and I think they should meet the man who's going to join them for dinner tonight." Ross raised an eyebrow. "Is that an invitation, Miss Porter?" "It is, Mr. Guthrie," she replied, a teasing lilt in her voice. "Unless you have more pressing engagements?" "None whatsoever," he assured her, bending to press a quick kiss to her lips before stepping back to disassemble the test pump. "Though your father might have something to say about all this." "He'll approve," Tabitha said confidently. "Once he sees how the windmill works again, and when he hears about your invention." They packed quickly after that, securing the bearing and a smaller version of the new pump design to their saddles. As they prepared to leave, Ross took one last look at his cabin and workshop. "I've been hiding here," he said quietly, "using work to avoid people, to avoid facing my failures." "And now?" Tabitha asked, mounting her horse. Ross swung into his own saddle, his expression determined. "Now it's time to step back into the world, starting with a certain stubborn rancher and his equally stubborn daughter." The ride back to the Porter Ranch passed quickly, filled with plans and possibilities. Ross spoke of refining his pump design, of teaching others how to build and maintain them. Tabitha shared her ideas for improving their ranch's water management, for preparing for future droughts. "We could hold workshops," she suggested as they neared the ranch, "teach other ranchers how to adapt to the changing conditions." "We?" Ross asked, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, we," she confirmed without hesitation. "Unless you'd rather work alone?" "Not anymore," he said, reaching across to briefly clasp her hand. "Not ever again, if I have a choice." They arrived at the Porter Ranch to find James and Thomas anxiously awaiting them. The cattle looked more distressed than before, clustered near the dry watering trough, their ribs showing through dull hides. "You're back," James called, relief evident in his voice as they dismounted. "Did you manage to make the bearing?" "We did," Ross confirmed, retrieving the wrapped part from his saddlebag. "And something else that might interest you even more." While Thomas peppered them with questions, Ross and Tabitha worked together to replace the bearing in the windmill. The task took several hours, with Ross explaining each step not just to Tabitha but to Thomas as well, who absorbed the information with eager attention. By late afternoon, the repairs were complete. The four of them stood back as the first breeze caught the vanes, setting them in motion. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed, the windmill began to turn, the familiar creaking sound like music to their ears. "It's working," Thomas exclaimed, grinning widely. "Listen to that." Below, the pump mechanism engaged, and after several minutes of operation, water began to flow into the trough. The cattle, sensing the change, moved toward it, their pace quickening as the life-giving liquid became accessible once more. James turned to Ross, gratitude etched in every line of his weathered face. "Mr. Guthrie, I don't know how to thank you." "It's Ross," he corrected, extending his hand. "And there's no need for thanks. It's what I do." "Not just that," Tabitha interjected. "Tell them about the pump, Ross." Over dinner in the Porter home, a celebratory meal of roast chicken and fresh vegetables from their small garden. Ross explained his invention, how it could draw water from deeper reserves, how it required less wind to operate. "With your permission, Mr. Porter," he concluded, "I'd like to install a prototype here as a test case. If it works as well as I believe it will, it could help a lot of ranches survive this drought." James studied Ross thoughtfully, his gaze occasionally shifting to his daughter, noting the way she looked at the repairman, the easy familiarity between them that hadn't existed 2 days ago. "I'd be honored," he said finally, "and please call me James. Something tells me we'll be seeing a lot more of each other." Tabitha felt her cheeks warm at her father's perceptiveness, but didn't deny the implication. Instead, she reached under the table to squeeze Ross's hand, finding it already reaching for hers. "I hope so," Ross replied, his eyes never leaving Tabitha's face. "I certainly hope so." The weeks that followed transformed both the Porter Ranch and Ross Guthrie himself. True to his word, he installed his innovative pump system, which performed even better in practical application than it had in testing. The deeper water it accessed was cooler and cleaner, and the cattle thrived despite the continuing drought. Word spread quickly among neighboring ranchers, and soon Ross found himself fielding requests from across the county. With Tabitha by his side, he began producing more of the pumps, teaching others how to install and maintain them. The cabin that had once been his solitary refuge became a workshop where ranchers gathered to learn and share knowledge. Ross moved his things to the Porter Ranch, taking up residence in a small cabin on the property that had once housed ranch hands. Though he still owned his own place, he found himself drawn more and more to the Porter Ranch, to the family that had welcomed him, to the woman who had helped him find his way back to himself. 6 months after that first meeting by the broken windmill, Ross and Tabitha sat together on the porch of the main house, watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The drought had eased somewhat with winter rains, though everyone knew the reprieve was temporary. Thanks to Ross's invention, however, the mood among local ranchers was one of cautious optimism rather than despair. "I received a letter from the patent office today," Ross said, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "It's official. The Guthrie deep draw pump is now recognized and protected." "That's wonderful," Tabitha exclaimed, taking the letter to examine it. "We should celebrate." "I thought we might," Ross agreed, reaching into his other pocket. "Which is why I have something else for you." He withdrew a small wooden box, hand-carved from rich walnut. Tabitha's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a ring, not a traditional diamond, but a unique creation featuring a small, perfect gear surrounded by delicate silver work that resembled flowing water. "I made it myself," Ross said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. "The gear's from that first pump we fixed together, the one that helped me find my way back." Tabitha's eyes filled with tears as she realized what was happening. "Ross, Tabitha Porter," he continued, taking her hand in his, "you found me when I was broken, convinced I couldn't fix anything anymore. You taught me that some things don't need fixing, they need healing. And in healing my spirit, you captured my heart entirely." He slid from the porch swing to one knee, still holding her hand. "Will you marry me? Build a life with me? Face whatever droughts or floods or challenges come our way together?" "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Ross Guthrie. 1,000 times yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Tabitha pulled him up to sit beside her again, framing his face with her hands. "Do you remember what I said when I found you that day with your head in your hands?" "You said, then don't, just heal," Ross replied, turning his head to kiss her palm. words that changed everything. "And look at all we've healed together," she murmured, gesturing toward the ranch where his pumps now drew water from deep beneath the earth, where cattle grazed contentedly, where hope had replaced desperation. "It's just the beginning," Ross promised, pulling her close. "Just the beginning of what we'll build together." As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, they sealed their promise with a kiss, surrounded by the fruits of their labor and the promise of all that was yet to come. Not just fixed, but truly healed both the land and the hearts that had found each other against all odds on the vast, unforgiving, beautiful plains of the West. 3 years later, the Porter Guthrie Ranch stood as a testament to innovation and perseverance. The deep draw pumps had become standard equipment throughout the drought-stricken regions, and Ross's workshop now expanded to a proper building near the main house served as both manufacturing facility and school, where ranchers came to learn the new techniques. Tabitha and Ross moved easily around each other as they prepared for the annual harvest festival they'd begun hosting 2 years earlier. Their daughter, Marie, barely a year old, watched from a blanket on the porch, gurgling happily as her parents worked. "Thompson's bringing 3 more ranchers from up north," Tabitha said, checking items off a list. "They're interested in installing pumps before winter." "Good timing," Ross replied, loading supplies into a wagon. "The new design is working even better than expected." He paused, watching as Tabitha bent to tickle Marie's stomach, eliciting a peal of delighted laughter. The sight never failed to fill his heart to overflowing his wife and daughter, the family he'd never imagined having during those dark days when he'd lost faith in himself and his abilities. "What are you thinking about?" Tabitha asked, catching his gaze. Ross moved to join them on the porch, pulling Tabitha into his arms while Marie grabbed at his bootlaces. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am that you found me that day. How different everything would be if you hadn't." "I think I was meant to find you," she replied, resting her head against his chest. "Just as you were meant to heal, not just fix things." From inside the house, James Porter called out a question about where to store the extra chairs for the festival. Thomas, now 20 and studying engineering by correspondence thanks to Ross's encouragement, answered before either of them could respond. "Our family keeps growing," Ross observed, his voice warm with contentment, "in all the best ways." Tabitha looked up at him, love shining in her eyes. "And it all started with a broken windmill and a cowboy with his head in his hands." "And a woman wise enough to know the difference between fixing and healing," Ross added, bending to kiss her softly. "Thank God for that woman." As the sun set over the thriving ranch, casting long shadows across land that had once teetered on the edge of ruin, they stood together, not just surviving, but flourishing. Not just fixed, but truly, completely healed.